quickly about the thesis of the book and predominantly your framing of the U.S. and China, which I thought was a wonderful way for me to mentally lock in how to think about it of a lawyerly society versus an engineering state. So maybe walk us through the fast version of it.
Yeah, the quick version of this is that I spent 2017 to 2023 living in China, a time that felt really momentous as I was living through it. I moved to China after working here in San Francisco at the start of 2017, and Donald Trump had just taken office. Then he was launching a trade war, something that quickly morphed into a technology war. Xi Jinping was being more repressive in some novel ways throughout this time. China was growing to be a more credible technology country in which was producing all sorts of new technology champions. And the centerpiece of my experience of living in China was to go through the entirety of the zero COVID experience, all 3 years from 2020 to the end of 2022. And I started to feel that these are two really important countries, and we're sort of reasoning through them with these 19th century political science terms like socialist, capitalists, neoliberal, all of these very strange terms that shift around and don't really mean very much anymore. And so the framework that I wanted to toss out to be playful and provocative is to think about China as a country I call the engineering state, because at various points, the entirety of the senior leadership have had degrees in engineering, and to talk about the U.S. as a lawyerly society, because all the presidents seem to have to go to Yale Law School. So I think I think about the engineering state in part because China treats almost every problem with an engineering solution of just building one more mega project, building yet another big bridge, building yet another set of homes. They also treat the economy as an engineering project. One of the other things that I lived through was Xi's attempt to get people out of real estate speculation and into, for bright young kids to work in semiconductors or aviation instead. And they are also fundamentally social engineers. So, when I think about something like the one-child policy or zero COVID, there's no ambiguity about what these sort of things mean. The number's right there in the name. It really feels like a social optimization project. And I think about the United States, which has been characterized as aviation instead. And they are also fundamentally social engineers. So, when I think about something like the one-child policy or zero COVID, there's no ambiguity about what these sort of things mean. The number's right there in the name. It really feels like a social optimization project. And I think about the United States, which has been characterized over the last few decades as basically not building very much of anything at all. I think a lot about how most of the founding fathers were lawyers. First 16 presidents from Washington to Lincoln, 13 of them had practiced law. Every presidential nominee among the Democrats between 1980 to 2024 had gone to law school at some point. And what are we getting, especially in California? Not enough home construction, high-speed rail project that was approved by referendum in the year 2008 and will probably not have any riders by 2033 at the earliest. And a lack of urgency about a lot of manufacturing projects. And so this is kind of my starting framework for thinking about both these big countries.
Lawyers versus engineers.
That's right.
And mindset.
That's right.
And so maybe just take that a little bit further for us in the places where it concretely manifests in a position of policy?
Yeah. Well, let's contrast a policy of, let's go back to high-speed rail. I promise let's not make this whole evening about high-speed rail. This is too upsetting, but just one instance. Let me start with an illustrative example. So 2008 was an important year for high-speed rail in both countries. California approved by referendum the high-speed rail project between San Francisco as well as Los Angeles. And China actually started construction of its first high-speed rail train between Beijing and Shanghai in 2008. What did China do? 3 years later, it completed its line at the cost of, I think, something like $36 billion.
And distance-wise, just to help people orient.
Yeah, about actually the same distance.
Oh, same distance.
About the same distance. And actually, after the rail extension to Sacramento, if that ever gets completed, it will be almost exactly the same distance. In China, the trains are going through much more densely populated areas. In California, it's mostly going through the desert. But China completed all of this, and in the first decade of operation, according to the official news, it had made something like 1.3 billion passenger trips. What is the status of California high-speed rail? Well, by 2033 is the earliest possible time that Merced and Bakersfield will be connected. These are pretty far from Los Angeles.
I feel like we need like a soundtrack of like wah wah wah.
Well, there it is.
It is. Well, the reason I want to go through this a little bit more quickly than you have in some of the other places is, since you've been on tour, that you've had a phenomenal number of conversations with leaders in government, businesses, scholarly events. And so what I really think is a unique lens to take people on today is, given how much has changed in the policy, in the landscape, the discussion points between China and the U.S., since the pens down for writing the book, not even publication date. And so maybe to start with that, what do you believe, what myth have you found here in the United States and in China is the myth of each other that is most harmful in actually helping us actually collectively solve problems?
Yeah. Well, on the American side, I think the myth has been that China cannot be innovative, that they can only steal, that, in fact, quoting verbatim from a tweet from Senator Tom Cotton a few months ago, which he tweeted on World IP Day, China can only steal, can never innovate. And I think these are the sort of things that really limit our understanding of the world. I think that, it is more than just, cyber theft or industrial subsidies that has gotten China to where it is. I look at China today and I see a remarkably dynamic, remarkably competitive country in which they are innovating really quickly and iterating really quickly on all sorts of projects. My favorite example to reach now is that, it takes something like 6 to 7 years for a Detroit automaker to conceptualize of a car and then actually have that go out on the roads and have that be driven by people. This is comparable to the Japanese. This is comparable to the Germans as well. In China, it is much more like 18 months. It is much more like 2 years for them to be able to actually release these sort of cars. And so they're just iterating much more quickly. And this is not because they have somehow hypnotized the rest of the world to move really slowly. It is in part because China moves at breakneck speeds. And I think the Chinese misconception here is that the U.S. is fundamentally, really rowdy and they can't get its act together. And that, Donald Trump is just way too erratic. Maybe on that point, he's they're kind of correct.
No comment.
But no comment on that. But in a lot of ways, they take a look at the U.S., they take a look at San Francisco, and they're not terribly impressed. And I think this is just how many ordinary Chinese have lost considerable interest in visiting California or New York or a lot of other American places because they feel that the state of logistics is just not very impressive actually being over here. And so, I would hate for the Chinese to make some sort of miscalculation that they believe that the American society is fundamentally going to be riven apart, that too many things don't work, and I want America to prove that it can do much better than it has.
Do you feel like this is akin to some of the challenges we had during the height of the Cold War, where people in the U.S. didn't understand Russia, the people of Russia, society, other than through this lens of movies like Red Dawn and other type situations, or are we actually, because are we seeing a little bit? Is it just nuances that we're off the mark on?
Yeah, I think that we need to. It's interesting you bring up something like Red Dawn in terms of entertainment. And, at least in the Cold War, we had this conception that the Russians were very fearsome and they're really dangerous. But because China controls a giant market of moviegoers, Hollywood is really keen not to upset the Chinese. And so they, who was the adversary in Top Gun Maverick? Totally unclear. There was they had no insignia, and so we have no idea. And so we're not even portraying the Chinese as the adversaries. In fact, we're not able to portray the Chinese in our movies almost at all. I think in some strange ways. And so there is some way in which I think Americans are fundamentally occluded about China. Very few Americans visit China. I think that's just a fundamental truth. The number of foreign expats in Shanghai peaked, I think, something like 15 years ago, and it keeps going down further and further. And so, people aren't visiting, are traversing these two in a very, frequent way anymore. And I think, I'm always on the side of more understanding. And part of why I wrote this book was to, expect that plenty of Americans will never visit China. And what I really wanted to do with this book, to write through the three main regions that I lived in, Hong Kong, Beijing, as well as Shanghai. These are three of China's most dynamic hubs. To write through a little bit of the countryside of Guizhou that I cycled through, to write a little bit about the city of Chongqing, which is this hydropunk city, which is really big with the influencers now. It goes viral regularly on TikTok. To just give people a sense that life in China is densely textured. Some parts of it work really well. Some parts of it work disastrously, and to just give people a little bit of sense that this is a flesh and blood, real life living place.
Mm-hmm. Well, to your point, maybe let's go on this direction, because one of the things that you point out is China can produce now some phenomenal technology. I want to get back to the technology in a little bit, but one of the things you also highlight is China doesn't know how to export culture.
Yeah.
And the part that I thought was really interesting was the analogy of Japan. Japan has actually become a cultural powerhouse in many dimensions, not just from film and anime, but fashion and other things.
Yeah. I think that, if we analogize to the Japanese, Japan, when it was growing really rich throughout the 1970s especially, it was throwing off all of these incredible cultural products that the rest of the world loved. So, maybe you played people here have played the Nintendo Game Boy, the Sony Walkman, anime, manga, you name it. The Japanese were producing incredible things like Mario Brothers that have still persisted today. Even the Koreans, which is much smaller than Japan. Korea's population is about 50 million. Japan is 120 million. China's 10 times bigger than Japan. Even the Koreans, we're all watching Squid Game and we're all listening to K-pop, and that is still ongoing. And when I think about China, China has lifted about basically 1 billion people out of poverty. It has made several 100 million people middle class, and maybe a few tens of millions of people very rich indeed. It has grown tremendously, and yet how many of us have been able to find many cultural products that we regularly use? And I think to some extent TikTok is a Chinese product, even though it is not necessarily producing a lot of Chinese content. Maybe some of us watch some of these art house movies by Jia Zhangke, but I think that is kind of a niche little director. And maybe some of us are reading the science fiction books of Liu Cixin, which I think are absolutely tremendous, the three-body problem, but that is still, again, a little bit of a niche product. And my, easy explanation for most of this is that China is ruled by engineers. Engineers aren't very good at jokes. They're not very good at telling stories. You go to a party with an engineer and some of them don't even want to talk to anyone. And so they're not like the lawyers. Lawyers are...
We don't go to parties.
Oh, okay. All right. No, yeah, you won't even find them at the parties, right? The lawyers do go to the parties. They're the most charming people at the cocktail parties. They're smooth talkers. They reliably have good stories. And so the US has this cultural power. China has mostly censored a lot of cultural creation. It has strangled a lot of cultural creation because the engineers have thin skins and don't really understand these jokes.
Do you have a sense of why Korea has suddenly been able to shift this way? Because in many ways, you think of Korea as also has adopted much more of an engineering mindset on many things, like LG, Samsung, others.
Yeah, I think the Koreans have been, they're an interesting case. I mean, they a lot of what we see with the Koreans, with a lot of these K-pop stars, it almost feels like running them through a factory. And I have a friend who likes to watch, who likes to study a lot of the Korean dramas. They all tend to have the same plot. You have a lady who is, attracts the attention of someone, of a CEO or a rock star, and then later it turns out that this lady is actually of very high status herself. And so it tends to be a little bit formulaic, but they have actually, turned to almost like factory-like conditions to produce a lot of pop stars and actually produce a lot of great culture.
Well, Team Huntrix, just for the record.
Right.
No one got that? Oh, man. Get up on your K-pop, people. So maybe let's go back to technology just for this, and I want to go down this direction because we often think of Silicon Valley as this primary center of innovation, and you really, I think one of the things I thought was really helpful is your analogy of how to think about technology, particularly through the lens of cooking.
Yeah.
And so maybe take us through just to level set us on the technology components of this, of how you think about technology.
I think of technology as three distinct components. The first component of technology ought to be understood as tooling and equipment. So these are all the things that we can use and poke at. So in a kitchen analogy, it is the pots and the pans and the stove that we use to cook something. The second part of technology is written instruction. So everything that includes patents, blueprints, recipes, everything that we could write down to really try to cook something. And I think the third most important part of technology is essentially what I call process knowledge, which can also be known as tacit knowledge, industrial experience, just all of the things that exist in people's heads that aren't very easy to write down, and that also exists between people's heads in terms of a lot of conventions. I think all of us in our workplace would understand very well that it is kind of impossible to train someone up to speed by just writing a lot of instructions for them. You really need to sit them down and really try to train them. And in a kitchen analogy, imagine giving someone who has never cooked for a day in his life before the most exquisitely equipped kitchen as well as the most exquisitely detailed recipe. We can't be sure that they're capable of doing something as simple as making scrambled eggs. I think that would be challenging. You want someone who has had some experience actually cooking to actually be able to make a dish. And here's the analogy to what is happening with the US and China. Over the last 3 decades, China has become a manufacturing powerhouse, such that right now, China's manufacturing workforce is on the scale of about 70 million people. Meanwhile, the U.S. keeps losing manufacturing employment. Manufacturing employment in the U.S. has plunged, mostly due to technology changes, some because of business cycles, and in part, and small part, but in part because over the 80s, 90s, 2000s, a lot of American employers shipped their manufacturing jobs partly from the Midwest into China. So China is now the site of most manufacturing of, let's say, iPhones. Still, the majority of the world's iPhones are being built in places like Shenzhen and Henan. Shenzhen in the south, Henan in the north, which is training basically this very large workforce to assemble the most sophisticated electronics components in the world. And these people are solving, 3 new problems a day before breakfast, really to try to, figure out, how to solve their logistical problems, their supply chain issues, how to innovate. And this is partly what the US has lost and partly what China has gained. And I want to, imagine a fantastic scenario in which Steve Jobs and Tim Cook decided in 2008 not to site iPhone production in Shenzhen, but rather to site it, let's say, somewhere in California or Pennsylvania or Michigan. I think it is quite possible to imagine that in this unlikely scenario, then all of the follow-on innovations of the iPhone would be produced here in the US. So I'm thinking about everything that includes consumer drones, everything that includes all sorts of electronics components, electric vehicle batteries, all of these follow-on innovations that flowed from mastering iPhone production, from very sophisticated electronics assembly. Much more of that could exist here in the US. And I think this is the core driver of China's technological advancements. It's process knowledge, not cyber theft or industrial subsidies.
Something that you mentioned in the book that really resonated with me was in that wave as Web 2.0 was taking off and big data was starting to become a thing. We actually had an email distribution list called the Data Drinking Group. And it basically became a list of all the people who were working on data, and we just get together and buy beer and pizza and just trade notes about what's working, what's not. And to your point, it really was process knowledge. It wasn't just the tech, but understanding how do we actually do things. That's actually where we came up with this term data scientist, all these things. And the line that really resonated, that I think you highlighted, is that the information moves at the speed of beer.
Yes.
And I really think that's a very powerful thing, and especially at the speed and the concentration of these societies. And the reason I want to bring this up is we have the beginnings of that again happening here in San Francisco, particularly with AI very concentrated. So maybe it's moving at the speed of mocha lattes or something right now. But what is that speed of transferring process knowledge looking like with new technologies like AI and other frontier tech, quantum, or other things?
Yeah. So a lot of my observations of process knowledge was, being with these entrepreneurs in Shenzhen, being among these factory workers, and just seeing how collaborative they were. If someone's fire extinguisher or something broke down, they can borrow another factory's kit, and they'll replace one later on. It turns out to be a lot of communication and collaboration. And I think that knowledge travels at the speed of beer or coffee. People chat about these sort of things. Knowledge tends to move around. People get hired into different firms. People get hired around frontier AI labs, and knowledge tends to travel quite a lot around. And so, part of my idea of, this idea that, China will catch up on a lot of technology is that, no country has monopolized any key technologies over the longer run. I think a lot about this example of Samuel Slater, who was a British industrial person who memorized a lot of mill designs in the UK, and then built a lot of textile mills in Rhode Island. And subsequently, he became known in the US as father of the second industrial revolution. In the UK, he's known as Slater the Trader. And so rather less flattering. So how will knowledge move around now? Well, maybe right now knowledge will move at the speed of pumpkin spice lattes. It's the season.
It's the season.
But I think that with AI, I think we are communicating a lot more And AI will, I think one of my hypotheses about AI is that AI will probably strengthen a lot of America's specializations as well as China's specializations. Because, what sort of data does America have a lot of, what sort of data does America have a lot of? Well, a lot of the American economy is built around, let's say, healthcare as well as services. And a lot of the Chinese economy is built around manufacturing. And I slightly worry about a situation in which China manages to automate Foxconn and the iPhone production, and they get really good at making drones as well as munitions as well, because they are able to train all of the data for the AI. And America gets even better at PowerPoints. Mm-hmm. And I think that is not going to be one of our core strategic advantages going forward, because the data is probably going to make us further down the curve of specialization of whatever we're at. And, I think this is where we really need America to rebuild its manufacturing base even more so in the age of AI.
Yeah, so maybe before we switch to some of the current actions that are taking place, electric vehicles, we saw the rapid adoption of EVs really here in California, especially in the Bay Area, around Tesla in particular. Tesla goes to China, but then China takes off in a similar way that we saw the drone markets take off. I think there's some people who would argue, hey, China dumps technologies, as you pointed out, the arguments of stealing technology, these things. You make the argument that it's really the competitive forces there that are happening. And not only that, there's nuances in that competitive forces, that some stuff actually, this goes wrong. That as a market system, this actually is going sideways. And so could you take us through a little bit of that journey with that and really take us to the point where it says, how do you think about how this is going to play out?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the weird ways in which the U.S. and China are kind of
I'm done trying out the next best AI thing for work.
Monday.com is a whole different animal. Marketing, ops, HR. Just click the star and Monday Sidekick does it all. It can craft campaigns, sort data from endless files, or just update and assign your team.
What if it messes up?
It won't. You still call the shots.
You sure it's
symmetrical and having all sorts of the opposite problems. What is one problem with California? It is a lack of homes. And, I saw a statistic that after the Palisade fires in Los Angeles, one of the local authorities in one of the local neighborhoods has issued something like 3 permits out of the lot of 200 homes that were burned down. And the U.S. is persistently supply constrained in all sorts of ways. The U.S. is not building enough energy at a fast enough pace to keep up with our energy demands. Right now, there are 33 nuclear facilities, nuclear power plants under construction in China. There's 0 under construction in the U.S. This year, China will deploy about 500 gigawatts of solar alone. And this year, the U.S. will deploy about 50 gigawatts of solar.
Well, as of today, we're about to have a policy to try to invest in coal factories again.
Well, yes, we're going back to coal. And so, these are sort of like just these really stark contrasts. Again, this kind of comes back to the idea that California cannot build high-speed rail, and China does. The U.S. as a writ large is not building enough energy. It's not building enough homes. I think it's especially stark here in California. And I think the Chinese are really doing a lot of that. But what are some of these nuances? What are some of the darks, underbellies, problems of China? Well, I think about something like EVs, as you point out. There's something like 10 really successful Chinese EV companies, and then there's dozens more that are mired in really difficult competition. They have a lot of debt. They need constant bailouts from the local governments because they're not making especially competitive products.
Local government, not the
Local government. So, the Shenzhen government essentially only buys vehicles produced in Shenzhen. The Shanghai government essentially buys vehicles produced in Shanghai for their taxi fleets. So there's a lot of local protectionism of the local champion over there. And so, in a lot of industries, something like the solar industry, you have basically not much difference between the top 30 largest solar photovoltaic makers. They don't make a lot of money. There's kind of ruthless competition. It is making a lot of young Chinese upset. They come up with words like tangping, which means to lie flat, which is their means of quiet quitting. It's their way to protest against a lot of these really difficult competitive dynamics in China. A lot of companies don't make very much money. The VC market has struggled quite a lot in China over the last few years. And yet something about that system has worked. And I think on that, as I write in my book, I would really like to prefer to have a society that has some degree of physical dynamism, in which the problem is over competition rather than under competition. And I would really like for Americans to experience, better subway systems, better bridges, better highways, better rail, more choice in manufacturing, rather than to have the inverse of fewer homes, not enough rebuilding and not enough mass transit.
So not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to, is you were in China as the drone shift really took place, where DJI and other Chinese manufactured drones really outpaced everybody else. Given what you're seeing now happen with the EVs, who wins?
Yeah, well, I think my default is that in a lot of industries, when it comes to manufactured products, China is doing really well, and I'm expecting China to win in a lot of these different industries. Again, electric vehicles are incredibly competitive over there. Last I checked, by the end of this year, every 1 in 2 cars sold, half of all cars sold in China will be electric. And I don't know the comparable figures in the US, maybe someone else does, but I would be surprised if in California, 1 in every 5 vehicles is electric. So that is a much bigger market over there. It is a much more competitive market over there. They're making, much better vehicles much more cheaply than what Detroit has been capable of, in part because they iterate much faster. And we can go down the line in a lot of these different industries. We can take a look at industrial robotics. We can take a look at medical equipment. We can take a look at all sorts of boring industrial goods like hydraulic pumps. China's doing really well and catching up on all sorts of these different things. We can take a look at something like music instruments. China is making better and better guitars and pianos. If you're musical, I think in any sort of hobby or industry that we pay attention to, I think in pretty much everything that we can see, Chinese firms are getting better and better in quality in all of these sort of things. And I strongly believe that in something like 15 years, made in China will be a sign of quality in the way that made in China, in the way that made in Japan is a sign of quality now. And so, I take a look at the U.S. manufacturing base, and I continue to worry. By contrast, in America, many apex manufacturers have not done well. Take a look at companies like Boeing, companies like Intel, Detroit, even now Tesla. For the last couple of years, maybe even in the case of Detroit, last couple of decades, it's mostly been a tale of woe for a lot of these companies. And so what I really like to do is to try to reverse these sort of trajectories, because it's not great if most American manufacturers get less and less competitive, and for Chinese competitors to be competing against them in the